joining us today. My name is Tommaso Canetta, and I'm the Associate Director for Diversity Recruiting here in the Admissions Office at MIT Sloan, and I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. I'm delighted to welcome you today to our conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion at MIT Sloan. We are delighted to be kicking off a series of events, our Identity and Inclusion series, through which we look forward to engaging in conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sharing more about the community at MIT Sloan with you through today's event and future events as you navigate the business school application process. MIT Sloan is committed to fostering a diverse and inclusive community, and we believe this goes hand in hand with our mission, which is to develop principled and innovative leaders who improve the world and to generate ideas that advance management practice. And we believe that a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and well-being is a key component of principled leadership and sound management practice. At Sloan, the community is engaged in these efforts, whether it's faculty doing research on diversity in the workplace, to staff committees and student leaders in the Sloan Student Senate, various student organizations and affinity clubs that work together to make Sloan a more welcoming and inclusive place. So today, we are joined by MIT Sloan's Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Ray Reagans, and Associate Dean for Innovation and Inclusion, Fiona Murray. Ray and Fiona were appointed to these roles this year after recommendations from a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion task force that was created by MIT Sloan's Dean David Schmidtlein in response to requests by the Sloan Student Senate and student leaders looking at diversity and inclusion here at MIT Sloan. In just a moment, you'll have a chance to hear from Ray and Fiona. We'll have a brief moderated conversation with Ray and Fiona talking a little bit about their roles and their priorities here at Sloan. And then we'll have a chance to open it up to your questions. So if you do have questions for Ray and Fiona about their roles, about diversity, equity, and inclusion at MIT Sloan, you can submit those questions or upvote others' questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. But we do ask that you hold those questions until we get to the Q&A portion. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. And with that, I'll ask Ray and Fiona to come on screen and unmute. And again, thank you for joining us, Ray and Fiona. Let's begin with some brief introductions. Could I ask each of you to just share a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, and how you got to where you are today at Sloan? And Fiona, perhaps I'll ask you to begin.
Yeah, well, Tommaso, thank you very much. Tommaso, I think that you ran around me a little bit because Ray is smiling because he knows very well that I would ask him to go first for the introductions. So my name's Fiona Murray. As it said on the previous slide, I'm the Associate Dean for Innovation and Inclusion at MIT Sloan. I've been a faculty member for quite some time now, actually for 20 years at MIT, and every year that comes around, I think, gosh, when I first arrived from the UK, where I was a faculty member at Oxford, I actually came intending to visit MIT. But every year, you know, I realize how much I appreciate being part of the MIT community. And so it's extraordinary to say it's been a 20-year journey. As a faculty member, I'm in the Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Strategic Management group. So that's the group that leads many of the courses and thinking around strategy, innovation, and also our entrepreneurship and innovation track. I took on the role as Associate Dean of Innovation about 5 years ago, focused on really how we make sure that we have the kind of pathways that our whole community needs to take their ideas from inception all the way through to impact. And then when Dave made the request that I take on some of these inclusion responsibilities, I was happy to do that because that was a joint responsibility with my colleague, Ray. Ray and I have known each other for quite a long time, but we've never had a chance to work together before. And I collaboration and the teamwork that we have is very much reflective of how we think about this, that we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of being part of a community and building and strengthening that community, and really thinking about how we want to have a connected community. And so it's a real privilege to work on these topics, which are absolutely essential. And those topics also form part of my research. So I've thought a lot and done a lot of work on the role of bias in how we think about funding very early stage ideas, so particularly in the venture capital and entrepreneurial world. And I'm happy to say a little more about that later, but we'll hand over to Ray.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Fiona. Tommaso, I've forgotten your question already. Who am I? I'm Ray Reagans. I'm a faculty member in the Work and Organization Studies group here at MIT Sloan. I've got my second column. This is now my 10th year at Sloan. Before that, I was at Carnegie Mellon and Columbia. I mention that because there are things about Sloan that are unique. I remember my first talk at Sloan over 10 years ago, and I believe the first question I received was, well, how would a manager use these ideas? And of course, coming from University of Chicago, I said, I don't know if that's really my concern. It's a neat idea. I soon learned that that was a critical question in this environment. We need to understand how the ideas that we're developing will be put to good use, how they be used in practice. And so, internalizing that thought, I've done a number of things which I think are relevant for what we're doing in this space at Sloan. I've studied how diversity affects the development of relationships. I've studied how it affects team dynamics and the performance of teams. I've thought about it, how it affects, how climate and culture affects the performance of people inside of organizations. And I would like to tell you that was the primary reason I took this assignment, but that wouldn't be true. The primary reason I took this assignment was an opportunity to work with Fiona. And when people ask me where we're going, what we hope to achieve, I point them to Fiona's webpage at, maybe you'll put the webpage in the chat, Fiona. When you go to this webpage, you will see it is a very vibrant, productive, and diverse community. And we simply want to do that at Sloan. Tommaso, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what I've said in the moment.
Yes, that's great. Thank you both. And you both kind of touch on this, but I think it's worth speaking a little bit more about, and that is a little bit more about how and sort of why you've gotten involved in this work around diversity, equity, inclusion, not just with your current roles, but also, as you both mentioned, it's been part of your research and part of your work even before taking on these roles this year.
I'm assuming you want me to go first on that one, Fiona.
Why not?
Okay. Yeah, I'm from Wichita, Kansas. Now I've spent most of my life thinking about these issues. I guess I started studying these issues when I got into graduate school, and I was looking for a dissertation topic. And it occurred to me that I've always been fascinated about how people who share different demographic characteristics, why in some situations they have really strong ties and supportive ties, and in other situations why they don't seem to have very supportive ties. And so the initial work that I did on this tried to trace those two outcomes to simple numbers. It turns out when people who share an attribute, for example, two African Americans, when they're part of a small minority, they tend on average to have really strong supportive relationships. But as their numbers grow, those relationships become in many ways unproductive for them. Why that's true, we can get into at another time. But I've always been fascinated by this fact. How people who share an attribute interact with each other varies from one situation to the next. Why does this matter? The kind of research that I do would explain, for example, why people who share a demographic characteristic might sit together at a lunchroom table, why they might choose to have their offices on the same floor. And while we tend to associate that with women and people of color, the kind of research that I do shows that it's also true for white men when they're part of a numerical minority by a demographic characteristic, say age, for example. So I've always been, I could go on, but I've always been interested in this topic, and I just started doing research on it when I got to grad school.
So I think for me, this has come from a number of places. So my undergraduate degree is in chemistry, and I then have a PhD in engineering. So Ray and I are actually both lapsed engineers. And in both those parts of my academic career in particular, I found myself often as a female in the minority. It's reasonably unusual at the time. I studied chemistry at university in the UK. For that to be something, there were very few women, and likewise doing an engineering PhD. And so I certainly have spent some amount of time thinking about that experience. As my work sort of broadened out to think about innovation and the role of R&D in innovation in the economy, it's extraordinarily clear that if we don't include women at reasonable rates, and if we don't include underrepresented minorities, again, at reasonable and appropriate rates, and if there isn't full participation, we leave a huge amount of economic value on the table. We leave an enormous number of good ideas, and we do something that is completely sort of lacking in equity. And so it's not just about diversity in terms of numbers, it's about diversity in terms of ideas, it's about equity, about everyone having the ability to participate. And so my work started to really try to understand why it is that we see those differences in the economy, particularly when we're dealing with the early stage of the innovation pipeline. So I've really tried to understand who participates, what does that mean, what can we do, how do we break down those barriers, how do we provide formal structures, and if there is bias in the system on the part of investors, for example, what can we actually do to negate that? So much as Ray says, what do we do practically is we can study things to 3 decimal places, but the real question that we have to answer is what can we do to make the world a different place?
Great, thank you. I think that's a nice segue into talking a little bit more about, what are your goals when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Sloan, or what are some of the areas that you're looking to focus on as you embark on these new roles that you have to lead this at MIT Sloan?
I'm happy to get Ray smiling because it's my turn to go first. Look, I mean, the central idea I think that we have is to have a really connected community. So for us, the community is incredibly important. MIT is a place that attracts an extraordinary number of incredibly smart and talented students and faculty and staff. I think in that there is no doubt. And every single person who comes here absolutely deserves to be at MIT Sloan. I think what we recognize, and in some ways this is inspired by one of our sort of taglines in all the branding work and what have you, but it really is real, is we're smart enough to know that we're smarter together. And it is the together part that is very, very important to us. It's the idea that everybody feels like they belong, everybody's ideas are heard, everybody feels like they can not only speak up in the classroom, they can speak up for themselves, they have allies in the classroom, that they will be heard equally by faculty, and that we can have, I think, constructive culture where we can actually have difficult conversations about these hard topics. And so another part of this is not just to create a more inclusive community at Sloan, but to actually create this group of principled leaders who can then go on and create similarly inclusive, connected communities in the workplaces that they go to, so that the individuals that leave Sloan have an amplifying effect in the world and in the economy, especially around DEI.
I'm so glad you went before me, Fiona. That was fantastic. Tommaso, in many respects, what we hope to accomplish is neatly spelled out in the task force report. This task force spent, about a year looking at the DEI landscape at Sloan, and they spent a lot of time thinking about where we needed to do better. And so when Fiona and I took this assignment, the what, in many ways, was already defined. We focused our efforts on the how. It's clear that we need to make progress on representation in a number of parts of the school. That doesn't mean that we haven't made progress and that by some standards we're not doing well, but we know we can do better. Fiona already touched on the next 2 pieces. This is an example. You'll see that I have horrible examples, and I'll stop after this one. We were in a session and we were working with students to think about how we could stay safe together. And a student made a recommendation and another student responded, "It's awfully privileged of you to assume that everyone would feel comfortable doing that." This was like a powerful moment. But the response was, that's correct. It is a privilege, and we want everyone in our community to feel that kind of privilege. This is the equity question. We want everyone in this community to feel like they have voice and they have the rights to use it and they will be heard. This is what Fiona said. But that's not enough. It's not enough because there it is, smart enough to know we're smarter together. Part of inclusion is working together. For example, Fiona and I had some reasonably good ideas about how we wanted to add DEI to the core. And we shared those ideas with some of our colleagues. And you know what? They had better ideas about how to use the material. So we followed their lead. That's Sloan. We used our voices, they used theirs, and together we came together to produce something that, in our opinion, is much better. We want everyone to have that experience at Sloan. And right now, not everyone feels like they have that experience. That's our goal, right? It's a fuzzy goal, right?
Great. Thank you both. And, Ray, you talked about, this effort around the core. And I know even though you've only officially been on the jobs since July 1st, you have already been moving a lot of initiatives and taking actions to move a lot of these efforts forward. I would love if you could talk a little bit about some of those efforts around the core curriculum, around orientation that I know have already been underway.
Can I let Fiona take that one? I'll take
Okay.
another one now. So I think that in many ways, yes, we have. We've been doing a lot of work on the MBA side. And so I think in some respect it is relevant for this audience, but we're doing even more work. Right now, we're partnering with our sister, our peer organizations to think about, well, how do we grow the pipeline for PhD students and ultimately for faculty members? This is a very difficult question for a single institution to address. The surprising thing is that the economists started us down this path, actually the economists at the University of Chicago. And so all of us are working together to put together a pre-doc program. And by that we mean after you finish with your undergrad degree, it's become almost standard practice now that you spend a year working on projects to get a sense for, well, what is it like to be a PhD student? And so we're working with other institutions to develop a pre-doc program across schools. Someone had the wonderful image. It was, my pre-doc will become your PhD student. Your PhD student will become my colleague. Pre-doc, PhD students, and postdocs. We're currently devoting our effort to developing those kinds of pipelines. That's going to take a while for us to develop. I've been heartened by the number of people who are engaged on this very important question. I'll pass it to you, Fiona, for the orientation.
So, absolutely. I mean, look, a number of you have already asked in the chat, what are the biggest things that we found to be the challenges that we face? I think, our challenges fall into a number of buckets. One is that, in fact, I think Ray and I may have thought when we walked in that there just wasn't enough being done. And we have found the opposite. There is so much being done. And I think this is true of many organizations, right? There's a huge amount of effort and action. And our job is to make sure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And quite a lot of that, I think, is about really focusing attention and effort and making sure we do the hard work to go from the initial sort of idea and conception, really driving this through to actual sort of impact and really making things happen. So I think, as Ray already alluded to, the work that's happening around the core and orientation is just a powerful example. So the core, as many of you know, one of the things that's particular about the core curriculum at Sloan is that it only lasts one semester. So that gives you 3 semesters to basically design a curriculum that exactly suits your needs. But the core is still a very powerful place where we both build community, we build a shared platform of understanding of a whole series of ideas that are the foundation of what else we do. And I think people have different views, right? Should diversity be its own separate course, or should in fact it be incorporated into some of the core courses? People have thought about this for a long time, and we've had attempts to try to do that. But this time, I think very much in part because of the mandate that we felt that we had after our Black Business Student Association community forum that our students basically led, that really was a very powerful moment in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. They were there kind of representing their experience and their views, and I think that galvanized faculty and many members of the community to do more. And it gave Ray and I a kind of an additional mandate, if you like, that we had beyond the task force. And so we've been able to really work with all of our faculty colleagues to think about how they incorporate DEI topics throughout the core. And we'll come back and revisit that experience at the end of the semester to really reflect upon what's gone well, what hasn't. Do people feel included or not? And if they don't, what can we do better and differently? So there's really a sense of follow through. And that actually begins, so I've told you about the end, at the very beginning is orientation. And so orientation, I think, we actually are starting that tomorrow, with a beginning conversation about what it really means to sort of have an inclusive community, what allyship means, how you can be a more inclusive leader. And we'll follow that through the entire orientation week into the core and out into the Sloan independent period. And so that, I think, is just a representation of what we've been doing so far.
Tommaso, there's one in here in particular I want to address. I think it's from Francisco Alvarez. Francisco says, are any of the principles advocated by late Columbia professor Catherine Phillips part of the initiative? So that's a very interesting question. And it tells you I wasn't being quite truthful. When I was at Kathy's service in Chicago, there's this video of her talking to her students. And she would always say, if not you, who? If not now, when? And when Dave asked me this question, her voice was just ringing in my ears. And part of what Kathy wanted us to understand was we have to embrace our differences. But to embrace those differences, we first have to discover what those differences are. And so, the initiatives that we have in orientation and across the core are about having difficult conversations. Because often those differences, discussing those differences, will lead to very uncomfortable conversations. So, Kathy is alive and well. I was on a call with one of her students, Denise, who's taken on this role. Another one, Michelle at Cornell, who's taken on this role. So she's very much alive in all of these initiatives.
That's great, thank you. I know we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I think we'll just kind of transition into that at this point, so we can try and answer a few of these at least in the time we have. So Stephanie has a question for any of us about being able to share an example of allyship in action at Sloan. I know certainly there's been quite a bit this summer, but Ray or Fiona, if either of you want to answer this, I'll pass it to you.
So much has happened over the summer, and I'm trying to remember the exact date. But as we were thinking about adding more DEI material to the core, a number of people expressed reservations. They didn't think that we were ready for these conversations. And then we discovered that one of our members of our student senate, Renata, was actually working with students to train them to be diversity allies. And so we met with them, and I have to tell you, it was the most amazing material I've seen on how to think about difference and to how to engage people who are different from you. And when we saw that and saw that they were training basically 20% of every ocean, right, in this capacity, so this is going to be a lot easier than we thought. And then when we shared that with our faculty colleagues, they had the exact same response, because now I'm not the only person who's responsible for driving this conversation. There are many voices in the room. I think that's a powerful example of being an ally. I didn't mention, it wasn't an ally on one dimension. It was allyship across many dimensions, right? And so for me, I think that was a comforting moment for me. I don't know if that answers her question. I hope it did.
Thank you, Ray. What measures has Sloan taken to improve inclusiveness and diversity? And this question from Anoop is really specifically about for students of color at MIT Sloan and how we support that community specifically.
I mean, I think it would be fair to say that, as I said, there have been ongoing efforts around these topics. I think that since Ray and I took on our roles, which formally happened on the 1st of July, and sort of more informally in mid-May, so it'll be very, very hard for us to take credit for, tremendous transformational change. I think that our students, both our underrepresented minority students and also all the allies, around them and around us, have been very much part of conversations about what we can do differently. And so one of the things that I think is really important is we try to make sure that our student voices are front and center. We spend a tremendous amount of time talking with them and engaging with them. Tommaso, as you mentioned at the beginning, even the task force itself was really established in large part in response to student and young alumni requests. And so I think our students have very much been part of that. And so I do think that that has helped all of us feel more part of a community. We also made sure that having this community, that Ray and I have a platform, we don't particularly want to use it for ourselves. We'd rather use it as a platform for others so that other voices are heard. And we try to ensure that those voices were heard when we've had these various community activities so that our students, particularly in such difficult times, really did feel heard by the community. And then the work on allyship, spreading that out, the work on the core is very much in response. So I hope that that goes in some measure to our students both feeling heard and in feeling heard feel inclusive and very, very valued members of our community.
I'll add to that. It's funny because, it's funny. I think Fiona probably hesitated for the same reason I hesitated. Wouldn't know where to start. We engage with our students and our alums on so many topics. What we try to communicate to them, and you can believe me, they use this fact, is that they have an open channel of communication with us. We want to hear from them because ultimately we're here to support them, and we do not assume to know where they need support. And so in order for us to be effective, we need to hear from them. So they have an open channel with us.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we have 2 questions about how students and alums engage in this work. So I appreciate that you've touched on that. And I know, our alums are very engaged in the work as well. I know there's a leadership group of alumni that was recently formed for our underrepresented minority alumni looking to engage more with the school as well. So it's sort of a channel that goes both ways, which has been great. Talk a little bit, Ray, you talked a little bit about this in terms of the project and the work that you're doing around the PhD pipeline. Talk a little bit about, at Sloan though, how DEI is reflected in sort of the faculty in terms of representation, or perhaps even I'll expand that question in a little bit about how faculty is doing work in this space as well.
That was 2 questions.
Yes.
Is it Irvin's question? What is MIT Sloan's strategy for recruiting more African-American tenure track professors? I mentioned the pre-doc and the postdoc for this very reason. It is a very hard problem to solve. And here's why it's a hard problem to solve. I'm currently the only one. And if someone is looking at our community, they have to ask themselves the question, well, why is he the only one? And they begin to draw inferences from that. And so when you're at a small number, you're in a vicious cycle. It is simply harder to recruit. We've made offers to a number of people. And it's hard to, first of all, it's hard to move faculty. I don't think people really appreciate how much time and effort goes into moving and recruiting faculty members. I will say this. When people spend more time in our community, they begin to appreciate just how serious we are about these kinds of issues. And our seriousness is evidenced by the research that we do. We put together a slide for our career development office documenting the research that we're doing. We have colleagues working on glass ceilings. We have colleagues working on innovative ways to increase diversity in pipelines. We have colleagues doing amazing research on interview bias. We have colleagues doing research on how diversity affects the performance of groups and teams. We have colleagues doing research on equity. We have colleagues doing research on how this intersects with work-life balance. And so when anyone comes and spends time in our community, they really are amazed by the amount of work that we're doing. It simply will take more effort on our part to identify and attract more African-American professors. This is clearly a goal.
And the other thing, can I just add that I think where we also realize that because when certain things take time and we have to recognize that, what we also try to look for is things that we can do with a shorter clock speed without forgetting the things that are the hard things that take time. And so there are 2 or 3 places where we think we can make a difference. So one is bringing a more diverse group of lecturers into our classroom. So those are folks who often come with very practical real-world experience that really complement the experience of our academically trained colleagues. Those are people that we can reach out to. Often they are among our alumni community to make sure that we can bring those people into the classroom. We have lots of really interesting, what we would call action learning projects that are very much a signature part of Sloan's education, working out in teams with companies on specific projects, so very impact-oriented projects. We're working on making sure that our mentor pool for those groups is more diverse and includes more underrepresented minorities and more women and so on. So we have other ways in which we can really start to make sure that if we take faculty in the wider sense of the word, as opposed to just professors, that we can really make a difference. And that's not instead of making sure that we build our faculty pipeline, it's a sort of as well as.
Great, thank you. A question from Cher here about speaking a little bit more, perhaps Fiona, to what support Sloan offers to women and underrepresented minorities in regards to entrepreneurship and innovation. I know it's a bit of a unique role that you have as the Dean for Inclusion and Innovation. So would you like to speak to that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that MIT writ large and the School of Management has a sort of embarrassment of riches when it comes to supporting our students who are trying to focus their energy and attention on entrepreneurship and innovation. And so we think about that as supporting people who really are passionate and committed to having a particular sort of impact, developing ideas, building a team, and really trying to take those ideas towards impact. So there are 2 really important centers that are based at Sloan that support our students in that regard. One is the Trust Center for Entrepreneurship. So that really is focused on sort of the early stages of the entrepreneurial journey. And we're working with that center to ensure that they have a diverse community of mentors to make sure that when our students walk in, they feel like they belong. And they have mentors who look like them, who can inspire them. We also have a center that I lead, which is called the Legatum Center for Entrepreneurship and Development. And that focuses on supporting students who are interested in building their businesses, specifically in the developing world. So Latin America, Southeast Asia, but we have a special focus on sub-Saharan Africa. And so in that center in particular, we actually have a tremendous number of mentors who are very international. The director of that center, Dina Sherif, is a extraordinarily talented woman who's originally from Egypt, been in the US for a long time. So she brings her own experience around issues of diversity and inclusion. And then the work I've been doing across MIT, and as I put in the link around inclusive innovation, there are a couple of very concrete things. So one is Wisdom, which is basically a site that basically identifies at the moment, women of all different racial backgrounds who can serve as role models. So nobody can ever have an excuse to have a male panel ever again, because we have made it easy for them. We have site doing celebration, and we now have some new internships that are focused on inclusive innovation for underrepresented minority students who are doing internships in startups. The fellowship actually funds half of that. And so that really is, I think, shifting the landscape because many of our students want to go and work with startups, get that experience. But it's expensive. The opportunity cost of doing that is very high, of doing that instead of doing a different sort of internship. And so we specifically have these new inclusive innovation fellowships that we really hope will help focus and support those student groups as well as everybody else.
Great, thank you. I have a question. I'm not sure if either of you would be able to speak to this, but from Shruti about making access to technology more inclusive. And I know this is an even more pertinent question these days as everyone has moved virtual. So I'm not sure if this has been part of your conversations in your roles or not around access to technology and issues of inclusion and equity around that.
It hasn't, but I can tell you that MIT has a program. MIT Central has a program, right? Where we give different communities, software and hardware. So there's a question here about what are we doing on other dimensions, including first generations. MIT actually does quite well. I mean, MIT written large does quite well on identifying people from lower economic classes or first generation students. And so Fiona and I have been actually focusing in our efforts on, Tommaso, as you know, looking for ways to get those students admitted into Sloan quite early, and then giving them the option between different programs, 2 or 3 years in the future. And we do that because it allows us to identify a very talented group of people, no doubt. But they're also a very diverse group of people, right? And so, this is something that we're working on. We think that's going to be effective.
Thank you. So, question from Nicole here around, lots of conversations around diversity focused on race, gender, class, LGBTQ plus communities, but not as much, related to disability and access. Can you speak to any developments in that area? I know I can certainly speak to the students in Sloan for Inclusion, which is one of our student organizations, who I know have been engaged in this conversation with myself from sort of an admissions perspective, with my colleague Catherine, who runs our student life office. So I certainly know that it has been a topic that has been discussed and is being discussed, but not sure if Fiona or Ray, you have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to add. I think the main area that I'm familiar with that we've been thinking a lot about is through actually our executive education. So in our executive education activities, which are our short open courses and our custom courses, we've actually been working with quite a number of organizations whose actual mission is very much focused on disability and so on. We've also made sure that in everything that we do in terms of videos and things like that, that everything is basically, there are transcripts, things are subtitled, to really make sure they're accessible on those dimensions. What I think is so interesting about the shift to so much of what we do being online, particularly at the moment, which is obviously for so many of us, a very big challenge. I think it also offers the opportunity to start to make our material more widely available as we start to sort of think about how everyone can safely come back together. But it also offers the opportunity for us to add things, as I say, like, the video, the subtitling, making it possible for people to access what we do and our ideas in different ways. And I don't think that's the whole answer, but I think that's a step towards that. So that certainly is something that's being spearheaded by our Associate Dean, Peter Hurst, for Executive Education, who's really thoughtful on that subject and a great partner for us in that.
Thank you.
I have to add, I hope people can appreciate that this is a priority for MIT. I mean, so many of these questions, part of the answer is there's actually people who are dedicated to just precisely that issue, right? And we can depend on them and they can depend on us. We work together as a team. So Fiona and Ray don't have to be responsible for everything.
Actually, we have a number of incredible faculty members. One, Hugh Herr, who's in the media lab, and another faculty member in mechanical engineering, who've dedicated, much of their research in engineering to things like low-cost prosthetic limbs, right? Using interesting materials. So Hugh specifically looks at very lightweight new materials. He himself lost his legs in an accident, and our colleague in mechanical engineering has been thinking specifically about how you have to completely redesign prostheses in order to be able to produce them at very, very low cost in developing countries. And he's particularly been looking at the market in India. And so, as Ray says, first we have an extraordinary, because Sloan is not a standalone business school, right? We exist within and surrounded by the rest of MIT, which is its own extraordinary institution. It makes what we do both more exciting every day, because we have not only our 120 something colleagues here at Sloan, but we have another 900 colleagues in science and engineering and social science in the rest of MIT. But they do really interesting and important work on some of these areas. So it can be wonderful to tap into those ideas as well.
Thank you. The question here brings up an interesting point. Bhumika asks, as a lapsed engineer and a woman herself, so Fiona, directed towards you, it's how do you strike the balance, or how does MIT strike the balance with wanting to uplift a community, say women, but not mistake looking at it as a monolith? So how do we become more intentional while also tailoring solutions to the often overlooked smaller parts of a larger segment, and certainly all of the intersectionality and identities that we see represented within our community?
I think it's a very good question. So I think when we do admissions, when our students come and become part of the community, there's this extraordinary balance that we see. Everybody comes and joins the community as a unique individual. I mean, it's like in any family, right? Everybody is kind of unique and brings their own individual ways of being. And we hope that what it means to be an inclusive community is not to kind of categorize everybody, but instead to make sure that we value everybody for the unique set of characteristics and sense of self that they bring. And to recognize that that sense of self actually changes over their time at MIT, that we are not only, when we arrive, our students and we as individuals, we change the community and we are changed by it. And I think that's really important. When we think about particular programs, I think, look, there's always a struggle, right? Which is, and I think about this a lot around gender, does it make sense to have women-only programs sometimes? Does it make sense to have programs that call out specific subgroups? I think there's often a tension, but to the extent that we sometimes feel like there are some specific challenges or specific issues that it's just more comfortable to address within a specific group, we might do some small amount of programming for a particular group, and people who identify should come and be part of that. But that's never going to be the majority of what we do. So we're trying to be intentional about those small activities within, I think, a broader set of activities that are focused on inclusion, allyship, and recognizing the unique attributes that everybody brings.
I'll take another moment to not be as clear as I should be. If you read the task force report, our dean did something, I think, in my opinion, which is very brave. He called out a reality, and that reality is that the Sloan School has not been doing very well with respect to race. And he made that a priority for the school. This doesn't mean that the other issues are not a priority, right? But he identified a place where we needed to make progress for students, staff, and faculty. This gives us direction. Now, the funny thing is, it also makes Ray and Fiona uncomfortable sometimes. Because as we push to achieve one goal, we have to be mindful of the fact that ultimately we're concerned with diversity written large. Right? And so I kind of repeated what Fiona said with another example. We're trying to manage these two objectives at the same time. Sometimes we need to focus in on one group, and of course that will come at the expense of other groups. That doesn't mean that those groups aren't important to us.
All right, thank you. So just a couple minutes left, so we'll try and get to maybe just a couple more questions before we wrap up here. And Ray and Fiona, if there's any in particular that you want to address, please feel free to let me know. I think there's a question here from Matthew around the training offered to faculty and staff around unconscious bias and how that may be brought up in the classroom, whether it's protagonists in cases or addressing student concerns. I know we touched a little bit on this, but it's an important question. So I would love to hear from you, around your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you. One thing to keep in mind is we know from research by our colleague Erin Kelly and Frank Dobbin is that these types of programs are not effective if they're mandated. They have to be the kinds of things that people choose to do. This one in particular is interesting because implicit biases is actually something that we've made the theme for orientation and teaching in the core. I've been absolutely amazed by the amount of research that our colleagues in different areas have been doing, not personally doing, but looking into, that's relevant for their subject area, in statistics, in economics, in finance, in accounting, in marketing. And so I feel comfortable saying that our colleagues are very much aware and are sensitive to these issues. There will become a point where we will make this kind of, training available to people, but it'll never be required because we know if you make it required, there's pushback, there's blowback, and it won't be nearly as effective.
Thank you. Look at some of these other questions before we wrap up here. Since taking on your roles, where have you found the most support for and perhaps the most challenges or obstacles as you've begun to take on this role and these responsibilities?
I'm sorry, I was reading. What did he say? I missed it, Tommaso.
That's okay. So question from Miriam, since taking on your roles, where have you found the most support and perhaps the most challenges for your goals?
From each other. Support from each other.
Yeah. So I think from each other, I think from Dave, so from the Dean, has been extraordinarily supportive and not only that, but often leading. So how we responded to Black Lives Matter, the representation of Sloan on our website, which may seem trivial, but I don't think it is. I think it's actually a very powerful statement about a set of beliefs that requires, work and action quickly. From our students and our alumni, tremendous amount of support. One of the areas, and so I would say, it's less that nobody's been difficult in particular. I think some things are just stickier and harder to to shift over time. But really, I think, one another, when one of us is tired, the other one carries on. And when one of us gets up early, the other one stays up late at night. And when one of us, like me, is on vacation, Ray at least can look more professional than I do at the moment, for which I apologize to everybody. So I think it really does. It does actually feel as if, even though we are represented as the associate deans for DEI, that does not mean, it means that we are responsible, but it doesn't mean that we're the only ones taking action. And so I think that's often a tension in DEI work, is do you have all the responsibility on one person so nobody else has to bother, or should it be completely distributed, which nobody is responsible? Well, Ray and I are responsible, but we definitely, I think, feel like we're doing this with a really committed group of people around us.
Tommaso, can I add to that? So, Dave, of course, Kathy Hawks, right? We didn't realize how much of an ally, Kathy would be for us in our initiatives.
Just so people know, Kathy runs our alumni relations. So that tells you something about the alum.
Kate O'Sullivan, an amazing partner with us. Kate runs our communications department. And I'll get to this one indirectly. Let's just say one night, Fiona and I were up late and we sent Rod Garcia an invite to a Zoom call. And Rod said, "Are they serious?" It was 10 p.m. And when he showed up, it was Donna, Fiona, and Ray. The admissions team, Tommaso, Donna, Rod, your team have been incredible partners throughout our initial time in this job. And we imagine that that's going to be a great partnership, continue to be a great partnership moving forward. We promise not to wake Rod up in the late hours anymore.
Great, thank you both. I want to be mindful of time, so I think we'll stop here with the Q&A. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and apologies to those that we were not able to get to. But as I mentioned, we hope to continue events like these and opportunities like these to continue to engage. So let me thank Ray and Fiona for joining us today. Fiona, especially for joining us on vacation. Thank you. But I hope that for those who've joined us today, that you found this conversation to really be helpful and insightful into the community at MIT Sloan. And we encourage you to reach out if you have additional questions. Please feel free to reach out to myself or the admissions team, Ray and Fiona. I'm happy to connect and continue the conversation. We encourage you to stay connected with us. If you do have questions, and also to stay connected with future events. The Identity and Inclusion series will continue on throughout this week with several different alumni panels. We've had several questions about engaging with the alumni community, so you'll have a chance to hear from alumni from several different affinity groups, as well as to hear from our Assistant Dean, Donald Levinson, about admissions and tackling the application process. And as I mentioned, this is just a start of a series, so please be on the lookout for additional events that will be added as we go through the remainder of the year as well. So once again, thank you, Ray, Fiona, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to connecting at a future event. Thank you.
Thank you.